Thank you so much to the panel. I think it was a really, really good overview of not only how complex the issue of household decision-making can be and how to measure it, but also showed us a real range of different approaches that can be used at the community level to address and promote more equitable household decision-making for improved resilience. I noticed, Mercy Corps' program focuses on couples, whereas Save the Children is working with men and women separately in different groups. And you have such a range of different contexts that you have to work in, and I think Audrey's point that there really are no shortcuts. You have to do your homework, you have to know the local communities, you have to know what approaches might be most effective, and then you also have to follow up and measure progress towards the goals that you're working towards. So with that, I would like to invite the panelists to please come and sit in the front here, and we'll take our first round of questions from the audience. And I'll do a few questions at a time, and I'll try to direct them to the most appropriate person, or if there's a specific person you want to direct your question to, please make a point in your question to do that. And then we'll take a second round of questions from online. So if you are online watching us today, please type your question into the chat box, and we will get to you in the next round. So does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask to start with?
Hello, my name is Christina August. I'm a graduate student. I had a question I guess I could pose to everyone. In trying to quantify, or in your experience working with community members, in how you figure out how they make decisions within the household. I was wondering, did you find any difference if there was a paternal or maternal grandparent that was living, or a living elder living in the household, and if that influenced decision? Just came to my mind.
Okay, I'm going to take another couple of questions. Yes, right here.
Hi, my question is for Audrey. I am Chloe Bass. I'm the Technical Advisor for Women's Economic Empowerment. And it's a pretty easy question, I think, but has your research revealed, you said you would wish for longer periods of time to pilot this. Has your research revealed some suggested length of time as we're designing projects and trying to build this in? Did you have a recommended amount of time that you would want to see these interventions? Thanks.
Okay, Katrina, I think your hand was next.
This is a really exciting event, so thank you all for coming. My name is Katrina Kosick, and I lead a cluster of research on gender and agricultural transformation for our Policies, Institutions, and Markets program. My question is directed at Yeva. These husband schools is a very intriguing idea to me, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more if you could tell us about whether formal impact evaluations have been done, how effective you are to sort of incentivize husbands to come, because I'm wondering if the challenge really is selection and how do you get them there. Husband school to me has some connotations that might be sort of insulting on some level, and I'm sure you got around that in brilliant ways, because it seems like you involved not just men but also very high-ranking, powerful men. So I wonder if you could tell us, what you did right, what was the experience, and whether some formal impact evaluation has been done on that. Thanks.
Great. I'm going to turn it back over to the panel. I think most of these questions are directed for Audrey and Yeva, so why don't we start with Audrey? If you could talk about the extended family issue, the time frame for the interventions, and then I'll move over to Yeva to answer the last question as well.
Thanks, sure thing. I'll take the easy question first. For the longer time frame that we recommend in the final toolkit we produced, we suggest about 2 years, and that keeps the training the same length of time, but then has a refresher training partway through. And then we recommend to work within existing programs and integrate it really fully into the program itself. So you're training your community mobilizers who are permanent staff of the program and working with communities to be their facilitators and be able to reinforce these concepts over time. So it could be any length of the program period itself, I would say. And I'll speak briefly to your question about the households with different grandparents. We did work quite a bit within households with the household dialogue that had a variety of different family members living together, sometimes many, many different ones. I would love to see research that looks at differences within having grandparents available in participating in these decisions or not, because we know that they often have a huge amount of influence and roles in the household. But within Nepal in particular, the approach was actually called family dialogue in Nepal because they wanted to involve everyone in the household. And in many cases, we had not just a husband and wife, but in the case of migration, which was quite common in a lot of the areas in Nepal, we would often have the paternal grandfather and a daughter-in-law, or several different members in the household who are participating together. And we did see some shifts when we started to see shifts in attitudes among certain members of the household, with others available as well. So thanks so much.
Yeva? Sometimes there's a delay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for that question. I've worked on the issue of men's engagement for women's empowerment for a long time, and we often get that question. And it's a recognition that to move the needle on women's empowerment, you really need to have a broader engagement than just asking women to keep knocking on the closed doors. So having said that, we work with men who are under 25 years of age, young fathers, young husbands, possibly fathers, who would select from the community and have a good standing in the community, and with the goal of graduating them from looking at changing their knowledge first, and then starting to address some of the beliefs and norms around household decision making and gender roles, and then gradually shifting into more of an activist role and organizer role within their community. So it's a long journey, and it takes time. And so religious leaders are really important to sort of validate that this isn't a Western concept that is brought in. So we work on with Islamic texts and scholars to address that as well. And so we've had some qualitative research that was done to evaluate the impact of this, and in some spaces, and I've seen this happen where it's seen as this is a men's empowerment program. How fantastic! Like, no, we're working with men to empower women, right? And so it's been you can see that sometimes in some of the initiatives, but and there's that danger of seeing that program in that light, and so. We've in the places where it's been most, I think, successful, where men really mobilized around that. There are some I think communities, and Tom can speak to that more, where it's still seen as why are men sitting around talking about these issues and stuff? But it's a entry point that we need to be finding in every community, and oftentimes it's the prestige of it. Oftentimes what attracts men most, and so but we need to be talking. Keeping that really thin line of understanding that we're working with men to address some of the inequitable norms and empower women.
Yeah, if I could just follow up a little bit, I think certainly Yeva and I have learned a great deal from the technical leads who, both in the field and here in DC, have really kind of managed this husband schools approach. I think we should be forthright that the model itself of husband schools, as we understand it, was developed by UNFPA. It was not Save the Children, but that Save the Children in Niger recognized the obvious need to really contextualize it and to adapt it. And one way in which we did that, and Audrey spoke to this as well, is ensuring that those husband schools were part of an integrated approach. Couldn't underscore that more. I think for the success we've had in LAHIA, it is utterly dependent on that integrated approach, such that members of the husband schools are also either spouses of women that are in savings and loans groups and or are participating in war and Taj groups themselves. So rather than just creating awareness independently and separately from some of the other interventions that the project is trying to carry out, it is absolutely essential. And what we've found is that while we haven't carried an impact evaluation specifically on husband schools, that we have learned quite a bit through our own formative research. And Yeva mentioned earlier, there is scheduled to take place this summer, the Sahel Resilience Learning Project, the SOREL project, is going to be carrying out research throughout the region, and not just LAHIA, but it's going to be looking at some of these gender-specific issues, opportunities, and barriers. So we think certainly some kind of more robust impact evaluation of what, if any, impact these husband schools had on other outcomes will be had from that. What we can say already for this formative research is that the husband schools have been self-replicating. There has been spillover. There have been other communities that have seen that this is really effective. And going beyond just the health and nutrition, which was their initial intention, and some of those husband schools have in fact worked with the village development committees, which are government supported, to mobilize investments, community investments in health facilities and other things that the community deems important. But those husband schools are really important drivers for that.
Great, thank you so much. I think we'll move to take any questions online, if there are questions online.
Hi.
Oh. Okay.
One of the online viewers would like to know if any of the panelists can talk about whether they have observed an increase in gender-based violence during the early stages of your respective research programs.
Are there other questions online, or is, okay. So let's take a couple of more from the room. I see one hand here, and then we'll move there, and then back to Frank in the back.
Hi, my name is Monica Kim, a PhD student from George Mason University. I have a question for Greg about index. So I understand women's or men's attitudes towards household decision-making in the four domains that are well captured by the survey questions, but these attitudes or opinions are heavily influenced or limited by the social institution or economic environment. For example, in many developing countries, women are less likely to have access to financial credit or asset ownership. So does the index also take this environmental or institutional influence into account when measuring household decision-making or women's empowerment?
The next question right here.
Hi, this is Parijat, and I'm also a PhD student from University of Missouri. I have a question for Greg related to measuring the tool. So in one of your slides, which was headed as input in the productive decisions, you showed some of the questions as an example to us, and there you showed like the female head in the household was asked to give their inputs for decision making. So I was just curious to know if to what extent, when the the decision or the opinion was given by the female in the household, to what extent was it considered or taken into consideration when the final decision was made at the end? So, did you include that in the tool, or like how valid will that be to ask them? Thank you.
I think Frank in the back had the next hand, and then we'll turn it back over to the panel, and then I'll do one last round if there's time.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm Frank Place. I work with the Policies, Institutions, and Markets program. Yeah, I'm now amongst the elderly in the room, and and as such, we always kind of hope that the younger generation is more enlightened than we are. And I was wondering, maybe both from the research side and the implementation side, if you've noticed that there's any changes in the way decisions are being made according to age in your work, and whether it is becoming more equitable, and whether there's things that can kind of reinforce that behavior at younger ages.
Okay, so why don't we start with the measurement questions, and then I'll turn it over again to our implementing partners to discuss any issues with gender-based violence after that.
Okay. So first, the social norms question. So it's not something. So we don't. It's not something that we explicitly measure in the WEAI. We do see. We do realize that these how decisions are made within the household is obviously determined by many of these underlying social factors. So we observe that in the data. We see, if you look across in the cross-country data, you do see those trends. But it's not, our difficulty is that we want a tool that is comparable across different countries. So it's, we don't, so we're limited to the extent that we can design the questions or the indicators that come from the questions in a way that, takes those, the country-specific social norms into account. But it is something that's when it's in the, like, you can look at it, you can see it in the data. But it's the maintaining that comparability that kind of limits how much we factor those into what we do with the data. The other question was about kind of the specifics of how those questions are operationalized, I would take.
While making the final decision, whether the female opinion was taken into consideration. I mean, they were asked to give their input, but whether at the end it was taken.
Oh, okay. No, I understand. We don't know that. We don't know that from the data. Our assumption is that we're approaching that by asking about the input in the decision. But no, I guess we don't know exactly whether we don't know the outcome of the decision, whether, like, to what extent the woman's her input was reflected in kind of the final decision that was made. That's a drawback, but also kind of we do that consciously. When we measure agency, how the woman perceives her input in the decision is in itself pretty important. So that's, I think, what we're trying to focus on with the questions in the tool, is whether or not if a woman perceives herself as having input into this decision, then that is a sign of her exercising agency, regardless of kind of what the final outcome is. But what you suggest is totally valid too. So.
I think also it's a bit tricky because the decisions, as I understand it, are somewhat aggregated. You're not asking about what you decided to plant in the rainy season and was that, finally the decision that was taken. So when you aggregate decisions about production, about livestock, it's hard to follow up on all of the specific individual decisions that may go into that broader category. So, Sophie, did you want to add anything to the measurement questions?
I guess just a pitch for mixed methods this conversation is leading me to. I mean, I think, there's certain constraints to develop a quantitative tool where you are simplifying reality in order to make sure the questions are well understood. This is really complicated stuff. I mean, it's hard to respond myself to many of these questions. And if you accompany this with qualitative work, you can get into a lot more of this complexity and use that to inform your quantitative instruments as well. I think also I took your point also to be that extra-household factors affect intra-household dynamics, and I think that's really important to underscore. I feel like in my presentation I was we're talking a lot about what's happening within the household dynamics, power dynamics within there, and those can change from within, and they can also be changed from the outside. And I think that a dual approach is kind of what LAHIA and Mercy Corps are doing by bringing women's power outside the household through economic activities, social networks, social capital, and also making sure those gains are sustained within the household through support from the husband. And we often see, like, if you have just one or the other, that's not as effective, can sometimes lead to certain risks, backlash, as working together.
Okay. Now I'm going to turn it back over to this side and ask if anybody wants to comment on any issues with gender-based violence that came up, as a result of these kinds of interventions, or if the interventions somehow were able to address issues of gender-based violence in the household.
Thanks. I'll start with that one. Thanks for that question. That's such an important issue when we're starting to look at shifting these behaviors, social behaviors, gender equitable behaviors at the household level. It's a huge issue to include. And this was a big part of our training for facilitators. We have a module on recognizing signs of gender-based violence and then mapping out different organizations that you can use for referral mechanisms if these cases could come up. We didn't have any instances within our pilots, and I can't speak specifically to why that was, but I do think the approach of focusing on household harmony was quite effective in just taking some of the pressure off people, so you weren't putting men and women in these positions of feeling defensive about behavior, but just saying, hey, let's have this conversation. How can we work together to address these issues? Talk about household budgeting and do some training, and then do some heavy facilitation around communication skills and focusing more on this very positive aspect of what things might look like when we're shifting these behaviors to work together more. And I also want to take a second to comment on the question about age, which I think is a great one. And we actually did notice a big shift amongst the communities where we were working primarily with younger couples, actually. And we did see a shift across the board in Niger in particular, where we were piloting the household decision-making measurement tool that we worked on with IFPRI. You could see in one community called Gao, where we were working primarily with younger couples almost exclusively, saw a much bigger shift in behavior than we did in some of the communities where we were working with a wide variety of ages. So that was also one suggestion of scale, is just to focus on the younger couples, which I don't necessarily agree with, because conversely in Nepal, we saw when there were younger couples that actually were open to shifting behavior perhaps more quickly, we saw some of the biggest shifts when we were able to work with some of the grandparents, actually, to go back to the earlier question, or the in-laws who had control in the household, and working with all these different individuals and decision makers in the household level really produced some of the greatest results. So thanks for that.
Great. Tom or Yeva, do you want to comment on those last two questions about gender-based violence and age and decision-making?
Well, I'll follow up on a couple. I can't speak directly to the gender-based violence one from the LAHIA project, but I did want to follow up just on this aspect, I think, from an earlier question of older generations in the household. And I think certainly, I mean, the example that springs to mind for me is Bangladesh, where our mother-in-laws play such a predominant role in household decision-making around household food access and nutrition. But I think, a very good point was made earlier by Sophie, is that is one set of decisions. There are many that any household has to make, and so the role of not only elderly populations, but productive working age youth in that household, I think, is another generational thing we should consider. And I think, again, I really appreciate the question about how are decisions changing. As the oldest person by far on this panel, I think that strikes a chord with me. But I think, in my former life, I was also a researcher too. So I think these questions of not knowing exactly how to put a finger on how household decisions making is changing, but thinking in ways we can all relate to about what some of the things that are driving that. And so, for instance, what might be driving generational change in decision making? I think mobility is certainly one of them, either voluntary mobility or forced displacement, whether you're trying to decide how to allocate remittances for someone who's migrated. These are kind of decisions that aren't new, but they're certainly becoming more common, I think, in places where we work. Livelihoods have changed also. So, and not just thinking about household decision making and women's participation in it, but men may not want to or have the skills to pursue the livelihood options that their fathers and grandfathers did. They might want to pursue others. How they go about making that decision, I think certainly will have an influence within the household and the community. And then risks have changed too, right? There are still multiple risks that marginalized populations, including women and youth, face. But those are slowly changing, I think. I think there's more, not only awareness about social exclusion, but more civil society organizations, more groups that we all work with at the field that are engaged in women's empowerment that I think at least in some cases give a resource or a safety net, if you will, for those who really need it to turn to. So that can help inform decision making. And then I think just reiterating a point that's been made so much is all of these things are going to be iterative, to take time. We can see real impact in a project, but at a country level, at a regional level, within certain ethnic groups or countries, nationalities, it's going to take, including our own, it's going to take some time to kind of reach our own social inclusion objectives.
Great. Let's maybe, do you want to have a comment?
Just a
before we-
brief comment.
Okay.
I think, thank you for really great comments. Just to conclude, the approaches around social norm change are really often mitigate some of the harmful impact of potential impact of the empowerment programming that we can have, but they also are ways to amplify the impact of the women's empowerment programming. And so I want to again emphasize how there's no bullet point. We can't just change it by training fathers and husbands, but it needs to be a holistic approach that addresses different both age groups and different segments of society, from the individual to family to the community.
Great. All right, I think maybe I'll take two last questions from the audience. So starting here, and then Simran will be the last question.
I was glad to see many others asking about men, and I'm going to carry that tradition forward. You're collecting data on decision-making by men and women, and you also importantly noted that consulting is often the same as ignored listening. Answering those same questions between mom and dads here in DC would be quite contentious. How are you evaluating culturally diverse variations in the same thing? And to go with that, and maybe it's related to what you were just speaking about a moment ago, women's empowerment and freedom, they sort of go together, but that must be prompting more family separations. Are you seeing happier, empowered women paired with newly disaffected guys?
Okay, Simran?
Thanks. I'm Seymour and I work with IFPRI. Just a quick question. So Audrey mentioned about the longer term impacts of these programs or doing them for a longer period of time. I would assume another objective of most programs that you mentioned today and others that are similar are to have impacts even after the lifespan of the program is over. So I was wondering if on the implementation side you could talk a little bit about programs you've done in the past that are complete today, and do you know whether they continue to have these social change impacts? And on the measurement side, like how do we go about actually measuring this maybe 5-10 years after the program is complete?
Okay, so maybe we'll ask our measurement experts over here if there are any sort of considerations to make these measures more culturally relevant. And I think that was your first question. And then what kinds of efforts have been done maybe to follow up with programs over the long term to see about changes in decision making, if there's any learning from that?
Yeah, so I think one point that maybe we could underscore more in this discussion is that how families want to be making decisions really varies. And I think the approaches that the implementers have talked about respect that. So they're talking about household harmony and trying to find kind of compromise and middle ground spaces. But I think I want to talk about just briefly how the concept, I think there's a lot of like more critical development literature that points out that just having high decision-making power might miss out on some women who recognize that in their households, if they perform more traditional gender roles, if they conform to the expectations of their husbands, that's really more strategic for them because that's their only option for economic security. So again, the extra household factors really matter for that as well. And I think that, contextualizing decision-making power is really important. There are, many decisions that women, that it doesn't look good for women to be taking. And that's, to get to that point, it takes a lot of social change. I don't know too much about the impacts persisting over time, but I think that you would want to develop a theory of change and think about, how measurement, how decision-making, persists in equality, and also the spillover, the kinds of knock-on effects we would hope to see in terms of other outcomes, other indicators of women's empowerment, education, maternal mortality. We hope that this is all connected.
Okay. Maybe I'll move back over to this side and ask the panelists if you have observed any sort of negative impacts of these kinds of family dialogues, or of broader social changes that you see occurring in the communities in terms of more family separations or anything like that.
Thanks for that question. That issue comes up quite a bit. I think we noticed that in all 3 countries where we worked, we'll often get questions from partners of, when you're talking about women's empowerment, doesn't this lead to divorce and family separation? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a legitimate question, and there's a lot of unpacking that we could do there. But I'll speak specifically to the approach that we've been talking about today with the household dialogue. And the approach we took, again, about focusing on household harmony and not putting pressure on different individuals who are participating for having to take responsibility for any of the negative issues that were coming up. As our program manager in Nepal describes this intervention as, what we're doing is we're trying to bring men into women's worlds and bring women into men's worlds. And what that looked like within the outcomes was not always exactly what we would see in terms of an immediate drastic change in women's lives. In fact, we saw in one case a woman in Niger said, "I'm much happier because now I can anticipate my husband's needs," which is not necessarily what the focus of the training is, but it's not, the change that we see is not, it's a slow and gradual change and within the context. And the goal of what we were focusing on is for households to be more harmonious and to be happier. And when you're taking that approach, and a very positive approach to the programming, that can have a huge impact as well. And if there's a case where once these changes are coming about, if this does make a woman realize that she is desperately unhappy in the situation, then that could lead to different negative outcomes that you might perceive from rates of divorce. But we honestly haven't seen any of that within the program activities that we've been taking, and that really just does speak to the need to have these approaches that are focused very much on households working together and household harmony, and this kind of gradual change in order to have households together be happier and working together better.
Great. So I think we're pretty much out of time, but if there are last comments from anyone on the panel.
Just in terms of measuring, and that every context is different here as well. And I think when contextualizing the measurement tools and using things like gender scales, my experience is mostly on the household and community level, not with large scale surveys, but making sure that you have formative research that informs, the facilitation of those dialogues and themes, and then in different contexts, the measurement of empowerment has been different, from just the value of women to decreasing acceptance of violence to other different issues. So it needs to be really contextualized.
Okay. I want to thank again the panelists for very, very interesting presentations and for sharing all of your learning and insights with us. And I want to thank all of you in the room and online for joining us today and engaging in this discussion with us. And we hope that this will continue, and we look forward to the next event. Thank you so much.